Hi, my name is Chris. I'm one of the coordinators of Supply Chain Management Association of Ontario, and thank you for joining me. I'll be your presenter for today. Here's the agenda. First, I'm going to talk to you about our association, just some historical background so you become more familiar with us. Then I'm going to move on to supply chain management, what that means as a profession. And you'll find that it really does touch every imaginable industry. Since you found our webinar, I assume that you really do have a good understanding about what supply chain management is already, but I'm going to give you our perspective. Then I can move on to a human resource and salary survey, so how much money you can expect to make if you're working in supply chain. Then I can move on to the different type of education programs that we offer. We're best well known for our SCMP designation program, but we do have a few more offerings. And lastly, I'm going to move on to our member benefits. Now, every time you're part of an association, there are certain benefits afforded to its members, and we're no exception. So about us, we are Canada's oldest and largest supply chain association. We were established in 1919, and we have over 3,000 members in Ontario alone. We have provincial offices across the country, and I'm speaking to you from the Ontario office, but we also have provincial offices in Alberta, BC, and so forth. Back in 2013, we merged with another association called Supply Chain Logistics Association of Canada, and we went from Purchasing Management Association of Canada to Supply Chain Management Association. We used to have a designation called CPP, but back in 2009, what we did is that we revamped our program and introduced the SCMP designation. Really, purchasing is only one small aspect of the supply chain, and what we did is that we expanded our program. We made it more inclusive of every imaginable aspect of the supply chain. And we are the only Canadian program accredited by the IFPSM. I'll go into a little bit more detail about them as I move forward. If you were to go on Workopolis, LinkedIn, Indeed, and so forth, and you were searching for supply chain jobs, these are some of the titles you may come across. So, Chief Operating Officer, a buyer, logistics coordinator, someone that works in inventory, operations, and so forth. And that's one of the reasons why people contact us in the first place, because they're doing their job hunt and they have noticed in the preferred asset section that it is a strategic value to have our designation. And a lot of times that's why people get prompted to contact us. Now, most of our students, they also work full-time and study part-time, and they have the employer pay for the program. And this is the most ideal situation to be in if you can work full-time and then you can study part-time with us. Now, what type of impact does someone working in supply chain have in an organization? So if you're working in supply chain, you can help your company reduce costs. Generally speaking, it's a good idea to have minimal inventory, help your company reduce risks, have good relationships with their suppliers. So you can consider how much to purchase, when to purchase something, what's the best way to transport something. Are you going to do it by land, sea, or air? Is something time sensitive? Is something perishable? Definitely, there's a lot of different considerations when working in supply chain, and it really does have profound impacts on your organization. Speaking of organizations, let's look at Amazon. As you know, Amazon is a very successful company, a very wealthy company. As you can imagine, Amazon really does see supply chain as a strategic asset. And just by managing the supply chain efficiently, it saves Amazon $4.2 billion a year. That really does impact the bottom line. So they have efficient ordering systems, they have good control over the inventory, and they have strategically placed trailers. So they have a good transportation network. Let's take a look at transportation in Canada. So in Canada, we transport 4 million tons of goods across this country every day. We do $1 trillion worth of importing and exporting. Now, if you look to the right, you see the traditional ways of transportation. You see air, marine, rail, and road. Now, road, if you look at the numbers, does account for the highest values of goods being transported, right, at $460 billion. Disruptions in supply chains can cause a reduce in share prices because people that are involved in investing, they're very sensitive to bad news. So if they hear a company's supply chain isn't running, chance they might start selling shares. You'll lose revenue because if your supply chain isn't moving, your company could be at a standstill. And of course, you'll increase costs and have the opportunity cost if your business isn't functioning. Now, it's a very common war tactic to cut off supplies to your enemies. So if you surround a city, if you surround a castle, and you don't let anything come in or out, what eventually happens? They have to give up. Why? Because think about Toronto. If you take a major city like Toronto and you cut off all supplies for a week, just a week, what happens? Well, in a week, most people will run out of food. A lot of people will start running out of gasoline, medical supplies, toiletries, and so forth. So the supply chain itself, we don't really think about it, but it really is a matter of life and death. To have our supply chain stop basically ends our way of life. And that's why I tell people supply chain is a very, very practical profession, and it's not something that can go out of style. Sector outlook. So the demand for supply chain professionals is increasing. Being on those job search engines, constant stream of job postings, never shortage of people looking to hire good supply chain professionals. And there's a lot of unmet employment coming over the next few years because of retirements and poaching. So poaching is where you have one headhunter try to pull an employee from one company to go to another company. So back in 2012, the Canadian Supply Chain Sector Council did this study, and in 2005, 5% of the people working in supply chain was over the age of 55, and in 2012, 27% of people working in supply chain was over the age of 55. So since people retire around 65, there's a lot to be new vacancies when it comes to the supply chain. There needs to be a new generation that fills that gap. But it's not just because of retirement. So new positions can be created. A company expands. So going back to that Amazon example, they're constantly expanding. So they're going to need more supply chain professionals. Or it could be that someone could be working in one function in the company and leave something else. What I'm trying to get across here is that, when it comes to supply chain, there's an endless opportunities when it comes to your career and employment opportunities. Now, when employers were asked, what type of skills do you want your supply chain professionals to have? People skills, surprisingly, came in the most at 28%, especially if you're working in procurement or the buying process. You got to be very likable. You have to have good people skills to deal with your suppliers. You should be able to negotiate, have good planning and analytical skills. You have to look at your replenishment cycles. If you look at your demand for your product at this time of year, going back a few years, you can kind of forecast what you'll need in inventory. So there's a lot of planning and analyzing when it comes to working in supply chain. Let's look at how much money you'll be making. So year over year, it has always been increased. So from 2012, 13, 14, 15, and so forth. Now, there are people making six figures in supply chain. Everything you see here are averages across the country. You do see a slight drop in 2016. I do theorize that because there was a drop in oil prices, and that affected Alberta. And because of if Alberta's numbers go down, that really does affect the overall averages. Okay. Now, how much money you make also depends on what industry you're in. Historically speaking, natural resources like oil and gold, for example, they do pay the most. There's a lot of gold mining companies in Canada. So the largest would be Barrick and Goldcorp, and they have mining operations across the world, not just in Canada. So they do have mining operations in Ontario and different parts of the country as well. Service, manufacturing, education, public min, they all pay fairly decently. Now, the lowest I've actually ever heard of someone working in supply chain was $40,000. This would be a entry-level logistics coordinator at a mid to a larger size company. Now, how much money you make also depends on where you're living. Historically, Alberta has always had the highest average salary. But you have to consider that it's not just because of supply chain. If you have someone working in Tim Hortons in Alberta, they'll make more money than someone working in Ontario, and they're working at Tim Hortons. But you also have to consider that the cost of living is also higher. So the salaries are higher, but also the cost of living. So Ontario does come in third at 86,000. For some reason, Ontario and Quebec should be switched in this map, so the placement is a little bit wrong. Now, how much money you make also depends on your age. So the older you are, the more experience you have, and the more experience you have, the higher salary you can command, right? So still, if someone's starting their career in 2016, $46,000, that's fairly, I would say that's fairly accurate. So I mentioned retention is going to be a very, very important thing because people are retiring. Now, the reason why companies pay for our program, one of two reasons. One reason is that it's a retention strategy because if you invest in an employee, there's a higher likelihood that that employee will have a sense of loyalty and they'll want to stay with that company a little bit while longer. But ultimately, it is the company that benefits the most by having an employee that's trained in the best practices. Okay? And as I mentioned previously, leadership and soft skills were cited as a major need by employers. All right, now let's move on to our education programs. We have a few different ones. We have a supply management training. We have a diploma in procurement supply chain management. We have a designation program. And lastly, we have our healthcare certificates. The healthcare certificate, I'm not going to go too much into, but that's mainly designed for people working in the healthcare industries, for example, a hospital, and they have a supply chain function. So a lot of people that have a procurement function at hospitals have taken this healthcare certificate, and it's become very, very popular. So the supply management training, I'll give you an idea on time and cost. The supply management training costs $8,500. The diploma costs $10,500. And the designation costs $19,000. I'm just going to repeat myself. It's $8,500 for the first one. Diploma is $10,500. The designation is $19,000. And the healthcare certificate is just under $2,500. Now, time-wise, the SMT certificate, that takes around a year to do. The diploma takes a year and a half. The designation takes 2.5 years. And the healthcare certificate just takes under a year. And again, all of this can be done part-time while you have a full-time job. Now let's look at supply management training. It's primarily made up of 4 major topics. There's the procurement, transportation, operations, and logistics. These technical courses can be done online or in class. Aside from the technical courses, there are seminars to do. So each of them are 2 days each, but they have to be done in person. There's communications, negotiations, contract law, finance and accounting, marketing, and business planning. There is no prerequisite to enter this program. However, after you complete this education program and you attain 1 year work experience in supply chain, you will be granted the certificates. If you have work experience prior to entering the program, and then you finish the certificate, finish the courses, you'll also be granted the certificate. So we do grandfather in your previous work experience. The supply management training, it's good for people that are just getting into supply chain. For some reason, they've always had it in the back of their mind that this was something that interested them, but they've never really gotten around it. So the supply management training is a really, really good introduction to supply chain. Also, that people could be working supply chain for a while and they never really have much education in it, and they want a little bit more formalized. So the SMT really is a good option for them. Let's talk about the diploma in procurement and supply chain management. Like I said, it probably takes a year and a half to do. It's made up of 3 major webinars, these business management courses: supply management, business admin, financial scope of supply chain management, and evaluating supply management costing data. The webinars are very, very similar to what you see now. Usually people would call in once a week from 6:30 to 8:30, and they listen to a live webinar. And there is discussions, you can ask questions, and there is an interaction online. Aside from the webinars, there are seminars to do, all the ones you see listed. So these ones have to be done in class, while the business management courses are webinars. So negotiations, you got supply management, sourcing, transportation, purchasing, process and practice, and so forth. Okay. Now, after the business management courses, seminars, and completed, there is something a workshop and case study. This is a 3-day in-class seminar where you recap everything you learned in the program. And after that, you would be granted your diploma. There is a prerequisite to entering the diploma program. You need to have at least 2 years work experience in supply chain prior to entering the program. So there is an application process. I would say the diploma, it's good for someone that might not necessarily want to commit the time and money needed to do the designation, but yet they want a little bit more in-depth knowledge in supply chain, a little bit more than S&T. So the diploma is a good option between the two programs. Okay, let's move on to our designation program, our flagship. There are certain prerequisites to enter this program. You need to have a business degree or a business diploma. We also accept engineers. Now, if you don't have any of those education components that I mentioned, we also accept people based on work experience. So what we're looking for is 10 years work experience in supply chain. It's either the education entry path or work experience. If you're not sure if you qualify to enter our program, definitely give us a call, shoot us an email, send us your resume, and we will be happy to assess your eligibility to enter our program. Because some people do fall in the gray zone. They could be like a year short, and this would be a judgment call on our end. Designation reciprocity. Hypothetically speaking, what would happen if you got your designation here in Canada and you were to move to the United States? There is another association called the ISM that's more well-known in the United States, and they have their own designation. And so you would, if you got your designation here in Canada, you would, and if you went to the United States, you would get a designation from them. And it's not a situation where you need to do any more coursework. You would fill out some extra paperwork and you would get your newsletters. Now, at the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned the IFPSM, the International Federation of Purchasing and Supply Management. Now, what they are is a union of 48 purchasing associations around the world, and they have 250,000 members. Now, what they did is that they evaluated our program and said it was up to a certain standard, and so our designation holders get a digital certificate that's recognized in Europe, in Asia, so wherever you travel with your designation, it does give global mobility and recognition. Now, the designation itself, it's made up of 8 modules. 4 of them are 13 weeks long, 4 of them are 7 weeks long. You can do them online or in person. There are 6 workshops to do. 3 of them are 2 days long, 2 of them are 3 days long, and there's only one 4-day long negotiations workshop. There's something called In Residence Week. This is an event that happens once a year, usually in May. And what happens is that you have all the people across the country that's expected to graduate that year. They would gather together, usually at a university, and they would help recap what they learned in the program. They would take part in group work, simulations, and what that does is that it prepares them for the final national exam, which usually happens in June. Now, while you're in the program, you're expected to accumulate 3 years work experience. So we have experience report, and you would submit yearly experience reports. If you have work experience prior to entering a program, we would accept 1 year work experience prior to entering our program, and that would only leave you with 2 years work experience to report while you're in the program. Now, let's look at the topics. So on the top left-hand corner, you see supply chain management. And where it says M, stands for module versus IW, it stands for interactive workshop. So you're supposed to take supply chain management first prior to taking any of the other modules, okay? But after supply chain management, you can do the modules in any order you want. Now, the interactive workshops can be done in any order. You can even do those before the modules if you wish. So let's just look at our topics. We have procurement, logistics, communications, how to manage risk, how a supply chain works on a global scale, ethical behavior, how supply chain works in the public sector, competitive bidding, which is kind of like a contract law. So every imaginable aspect of the supply chain, we do include into our program, okay? Our program is case-based. So it's not a multiple choice kind of testing. It's more that you're given a scenario, you're given a company, and you're supposed to analyze it. You're supposed to make recommendations, identify issues. What we're trying to do is that we want our graduates to think strategically, to solve problems, to be able to find solutions and to justify your answers, okay? So that makes it very, very difficult to cheat because you have to think, you have to be creative, and you have to use your training, okay? Demonstrate your knowledge. So that's why it's a very, very, I would say, a very practical program because we use real world experiences and real world examples. And if you pass our program, here's where you'll be sitting. This is a picture of our convocation. So usually in October, we have our convocation and our graduates of our different programs would get together. We'd have a big event. People go up on stage, get their picture taken, have dinner, dance. So it's a really, really touching event. I really enjoy it personally very much. Seeing my students there, you know, shaking their hand, meeting the family, taking a picture with them. So, you know, I'm very, very proud of every one of our graduates. And the designation difference. So the reason why people get our designation is really ultimately to help them in their career. I was speaking to a person once, and he was looking for a job in supply chain. He performed very well in the job interviews, but they said to him that they couldn't hire him because there were already people in their organization that had the designation, and they can't hire someone on top of them that doesn't have their designation. And so that kind of conversation prompted him to call us. I've also received calls where people are up for promotion, but it's their company policy that they can't get beyond a certain level without a designation, and that's why they would choose to pursue our designation because, you know, internally it doesn't matter to that company. Member benefits. Now, we have a lot of different benefits that we give our members. We have the Career Center. This is kind of like a job board. We also have events that does interview skills, resume writing skills. We give those to our members, very popular. Event and networking opportunities, benefit programs, publications, professional credibility, and education discounts. I'm going to go into more of these as I move forward. Okay, so networking. Networking can be done in many different ways. One, the simplest way is that when you're attending class, you'll get to meet people from basically every imaginable industry, because like I said, most of our members, most of our students work full time. And so you'll meet people from telecommunications, auto manufacturing, pharmaceutical, government entities like the Canada Post. So it really does touch every single industry, okay? So aside from, you know, just going to class and our seminars and meeting people there, we have our annual conference. That's the convocation, the picture that I showed you. But it's not just the convocation that takes place in October. There is an overall conference that's attached to it. And people that graduated our program and people that just members, they would attend it, and they would attend to different sessions because we usually have a theme for our convocation or our conference. So it could be based around technology, for example, and a lot of the speakers at that conference will be speaking about technology. Now, networking, it's not just done face-to-face. It can be done virtually as well. We have something called a mentorship program. uses a program called Mentor City. The closest analogy I can think of would be like online dating. Okay, so you have two sides. You have a mentor and you have a mentee. And both sides would fill out what they're looking for and the computer would match them. So if you do have a lot of work experience, a lot of knowledge to share, it's good to be a mentor and to give back to the next generation. And of course, if you're someone that's starting out, hopefully you have someone that would guide you, just to learn from their mistakes, give you the wisdom and so forth, okay? The last time I checked here, there was around 200 pairs. Okay? So it is something that does have some popularity with our members. Okay, career resources. We have something called Webinar Wednesdays. It doesn't happen every Wednesdays. It could be every other Wednesdays, for example. So Webinar Wednesdays is a webinar taking place between 12 and 1. So you can listen on your lunchtime. And it covers a lot of different topics. So we can have a webinar on robotics. We had webinars on tree trees, blockchain, and so forth. So whatever hot topic there is out there, we can create a webinar around it. Facility tours. This is kind of like a plant tour, and it's very, very popular with our members. Okay, so we've had plant tours at Celestica, Home Depot, Walmart, Staples, and Siemens Brewery, and we're also constantly thinking about adding more places because we've seen the popularity of facility tours. We just got to give the people what they want. So these facility tours, they're a good way to meet members and also to have an inside look of a company and see how they work their supply chain. So it's definitely a very fun event. We also have different publications you'll have subscriptions to. So MMMD, Purchasing B2B, Canadian Shipper, and we also, our national office issues its own Supply Chain Canada magazine, okay? So definitely every single profession has their own publication. Another way to get knowledge virtually is that we have a knowledge network. This is a kind of message board where our members would share ideas, ask questions, respond to each other. So this is a way to virtually communicate with our network of different supply chain professionals. So many, many ways to communicate with one another and share and grow together. Member perks. This is something that we offer that gives discounts on a variety of different types of products and services, like a ticket at via rail, car insurance. It could be plane ticket, a phone plan. Okay, so there are many, many different perks that our members can just save money here and there, right? Because it's always a good idea to save money when you can. All right, so that concludes my presentation, but it doesn't stop here, okay? This is definitely an open-ended conversation. So visit our website, give us a call, shoot us an email, and we'd be more than happy to discuss with you about any of the things I've mentioned, okay? So thank you for listening. Best of luck on your career, and we hope to hear from you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.